Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah hamdan kathira. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu wa khataman nabiyyin wa rahmatul lil alamin. Wa da'iyan ila Allah bi idnihi wa sirajun munira, amma ba'd. I'm going to tell you tonight about my journey from where I once was as a former Christian youth minister to how I got to where I am now. There's a lot of bumps in the road. You know, it seems pretty clear, yeah, you're a minister and now you're a Muslim, you know, but there's a little bit more to it, inshallah, so just bear with me, and hopefully you'll get something out of it, because the point is, at the end, is I want you to get the message behind the story, because if I was traveling around the country just to tell my story, then I would be wasting time. It's on YouTube. Anyone can go get it from anywhere in the world. So inshallah, we're going to begin at the beginning. I was born and raised in Greenville, South Carolina. I was born and raised in Greenville, South Carolina, and I was raised by my grandparents, because at a very early age my mother had stepped out and my father was working 2 jobs. So it was me and my grandparents. And my grandparents were the traditional, conservative, Southern Christian folk, as they say. They were born in, they were very, very conservative in their ideals and their ideologies, in their ways. You know, as you hear about, people being set in their ways, that was my grandparents. Like, we did it this way, and this is the way you did it every single day, and that was it. And we were very religious in the sense that we went to church on Sundays, we went to church Sunday evenings, we went to church Wednesday. And in Christianity, that's considered very religious. And it was not hard for us to go to church, and it was not difficult for my grandmother to drag me to church every Sunday, which as a kid is what they had to do, because the church was 2 houses down from our house. There was 2 houses, and then there was the church. So it was not hard for them to drag me every Sunday. And I hated church as a kid because of the simple reason that, we were brought up United Methodist. And Methodist is, for any of you know, it's very traditional. It's not like you think about like screaming and shouting in church and all that. No, you listen to the preacher, you stand up and you sing, you sit back down, you listen to the preacher, you stand up and sing, you sit back down, listen to the preacher, and that's it. That's all that happens. And the pews, as they call them, the chairs are made out of wood, they're hard, you get tired of sitting there, you're fumbling around, playing with the money that my grandmother gave me to put in the offering plate, all of these things. That's what I remember from church as a very small boy. But the thing that I do remember enjoying about church was Sunday school. Sunday school is what I got enjoyment from, because went to Sunday school, you painted pictures, of like Noah building the ark, you painted, all these pictures of Moses splitting the Red Sea. You learned the stories of Moses freeing the children of Israel from Egypt. You learn the story about him splitting the Red Sea. You learn the story about Noah and the ark. You learn the story about David and Goliath. You learn all these beautiful stories in Sunday school. So this was basically, as coming up, this is what I knew about Christianity, was the stories that I learned in Sunday school, because I never listened to the preacher during regular service. So that was the only thing I knew about Christianity. So coming up, this was how it was. It was just the norm. And the conservatism in my house, just to give you an example, and about the level of conservatism, is, let's talk about gender issues. Let's say when I became 12, 13, 14, and I started to actually, notice females, and I actually didn't think they had diseases and wanted to run away from them every time I saw them. Let's say I wanted to have a girl over or something of this nature. It was so serious to my grandmother that I had to make an appointment with her, let her know this girl was coming to my house. We had to sit in the formal living room, which in the South, I don't know how it is here, but you have the dining room, then you have the formal living room with all the nice stuff that you don't go in unless there's company over. And my grandmother either had to be sitting in the same room with us or in the kitchen where she could see directly in the room. I mean, this is just how it was in my house. This is how my grandmother and grandfather were. They were very stern. They were very loving, but there were rules, and those rules were the way they were, and they did not change. So this was my upbringing. And I would say at about the age of 12, 13, 14, more along the age 13, 14, I started going to the Saturday evening youth services at my church that were for 12 and up. And the youth services were held in the gym, and they were totally different than church. At the youth services you went, we played basketball, we played volleyball, we played dodgeball, we played every kind of sport, and we ate pizza and cake and candy, all the stuff kids like to do. And at the end, the youth minister, who happened to be my catty corner neighbor across the street. When I was 14, he was 17. He was the youth minister, so he would sit us down and give us a 30-minute lecture about Christianity, about something about God. He would give us a 30-minute sermon, and that's how the youth services were. And going to these youth services, I met some other people who went to other youth services. They invited me to Young Men for Christ and other things that were going on in South Carolina. And so I started to go to these different retreats and camping trips with them. And so that is when I would say that I started to become a Christian out of will. I became a Christian because I wanted to, not because it was something I was dragged to do. I started to actually want to be Christian. This is something I wanted to do. I made my own choice and my own decision to do it. So when I turned 15, I started going to high school. And when I was a freshman in high school, my best friend, who was the youth minister, was a senior in high school. And I remember we had a very close bond because I had not had my license yet, so I used to ride with him to school every day. And it was a big deal for me to be able to ride to school with a senior, especially since he had a brand new, or it was a brand new, but he had a restored '67 Mustang, which I've always been a fan of cars when I was a kid. So we had a very close bond, and we were very good friends because both of our parents were very similar. They didn't let us do much. So we spent a lot of time with each other. And when I became a sophomore, he graduated and started to attend Bob Jones University. I don't know if that rings a bell with anyone, but Bob Jones University is a very prestigious conservative Christian college in South Carolina. It's probably the most conservative college I've ever seen. Because the Moody Institute is known as one of the most famous in this country, it's in Chicago. But Bob Jones is conservative to the point to where when it comes to men and women, like men and women are not allowed to get caught talking to each other in a room alone if they're not married, holding hands on campus. The men had to wear button-up shirts or polo shirts tucked in with slacks or jeans. The women had to wear skirts. No jeans, skirts that came down to the ankle, and a shirt that came to the wrist. And this was part of the guidelines for Bob Jones University. You didn't party, you didn't drink, there was none of this that happened at Bob Jones University. And he started going there, and his major was textual criticism. And textual criticism probably doesn't ring a bell with anyone, and to explain it in detail would probably take another entire lecture. But just to give you a brief synopsis of what is textual criticism. A textual critic takes the ancient manuscripts of the Bible, the pieces of parchment that were found all over the world, and he has to learn Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, Latin, these languages that these parchments have been found in. And he has to take these scriptures and try to find out where they came from, why there are variations in the many different versions of the same parchment. Let's say you have Matthew chapter 1 from the Bible. There might be 5,000 different variant readings of Matthew chapter 1 in 6 languages. And so he has to be able to take all these and sift through them, try to find out why there's so many variations of the readings, and then determine which one is the original. And that's not as easy a task as it seems. You could figure, which whenever the oldest is probably a more original, which is not the case. Since there are no originals, you might have one parchment that is the oldest parchment of the group, but it might be a copy of 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 a copy laden with mistakes. And then you might have the newest parchment in the series that might be a once over copy from an original, or a twice over second copy from an original. Therefore, it would make the newer parchment more original than the older one. So it's not a very easy field to go into. And he started studying textual criticism, and being that I was his best friend, I started studying textual criticism. Whenever he was, doing his homework or research papers, I was right there with him. Whenever he did a homework, he would always let me read it. Or when he finished his papers, he would give them to me. He would pass down all of his papers to me. Every textbook, when he was done with it, he would give it to me. I started to learn a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Hebrew. So I became, started to become a layman's textual critic, and I applied to Bob Jones University in my sophomore year because it was a 3-year waiting process for Bob Jones. And when I turned 16, almost 17, my friend came to me one day and he asked me a question that I had never really even pondered upon. He asked me, he said, "Have you ever read the Bible?" And I said, no, in church. I mean, yeah, we've all read the Bible in church. You know, your parents make you open it up and look at it. And at the Bible studies I went to, Young Men for Christ, we did have Bible studies, and we'd read a few passages and talk for 2 hours about those few passages. But he's like, no, have you ever read it? You know, like you read a book beginning to end. I said, no, I don't know anybody that's read, nobody that I knew had ever read it, beginning Genesis 1 to the end. He said, but this is the inerrant Word of God, as we are taught. This is our instructions on earth. Why haven't we read it? You know, why have we not read this book? And I said, you know, that's a very good question. And he gave me a challenge. Well, it was basically a challenge for us both. He said, let us start with Genesis 1:1, and let's read the Bible, and let's see what God says to us. Because this is the inerrant Word of God, inspired to men, for instructions for us. So let us see what God says to us. If God can talk to the preacher through this book, why can't he talk to me? I said, you're right. I said, that's very good. I had a lot of time on my hands. I wasn't really allowed to do much anyway after school, so I said, why not? Let's read the Bible. I was somewhat nerdy as a 14, 15-year-old, 16-year-old. So we started to read the Bible, and we decided to go from Genesis 1:1. And what we tried to do, this was the attempt that we made, was to not think of anything that we'd ever heard about Christianity, but to open the Bible, and let's say I just found this book in the desert, and read it and see what it says to me. Let it talk to us. So we started Genesis 1:1, and we started reading through the Bible. You know, we did some of it together, and most of it I did by myself, because I'm a very, very quick reader, so I decided to read a lot on my own. And as I was reading through the Bible, I started to notice the stories that I had heard in Sunday school. You know, you start reading Genesis, you read about Adam and Eve, we all know that story. You started reading about Deuteronomy, Exodus, you know, the stories of Moses, the story of Noah, the story of Lot and Abraham, and all these stories that I know. But I was surprisingly and astonishingly shocked by some of the stories that I read about these same people that I learned about in Sunday school. Just for instance, and this is a big testament to why Allah kept sending us prophets and why Islam was sent as a complete and perfected deen with the Quran. If you read about Noah in the Bible, there is the story about Noah saving humanity from the flood with an ark and all of that. There is this in the Bible. There's another aspect to the story of Noah that not many people know about unless they actually take time to open a Bible. This will not be preached from any pulpit anywhere. Is that the Bible says that Noah was an alcoholic. This is the Bible's portrayal of Noah, or Nuh alayhi salam, that he was an alcoholic, that he was a drunkard. This is the word used in the Bible, that he was a man given to alcohol. And I'm a psychology major, and my field of specialty is mental illnesses, and alcoholism is one of those, is a mental illness. And I know from seeing alcoholism's effect on one of my close friends' parents, I know that someone who is truly addicted to alcohol, and if Noah lived for so long addicted to alcohol, he was seriously addicted to alcohol. It is hard for someone addicted to alcohol to hold down a 9-to-5 job working at McDonald's flipping hamburgers, much less construct an ark to save humanity from a flood that's never happened. So that stopped me for a moment in my tracks, and I said, Noah was an alcoholic, you know, and it bothered me for a minute, because I said, you know, things started popping in my mind like, if Noah was a drunkard, how did he know God was talking to him? Because, you know, I've seen some people, they're alcoholics, you know, you were just asleep in my dog's food bowl the other night, drooling, and now you're telling me you were talking to God last night. You know, you know, to rationally, that would not make sense to me. That's like, you know, an alcoholic on the street coming to you and tell you God's talking to him. You know, he has no, this would give this man no validity. This man has no validity with anyone. So I didn't pay too much attention. It caught me, but I said, you know what, I'm going to keep going, because there's one thing that you don't do in Christianity, and I'll tell you what it is in a minute when I started doing it. Then I came across the story of Lot, or Lut alayhi salam, and we all know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in these stories, but there's another very twisted story in the Bible about Lot and his daughters. There's a story of Lot and his daughters in the Bible that says his daughters got him drunk one night and seduced him and committed incest with him. This is the Bible. This is one of the Bible portrayals of the prophets of God. The person who saved his family from Sodom and Gomorrah. This is the story that is in the Bible. So I'm catching myself again like, oh, this is becoming a really bad habit that I'm seeing. This is becoming a bad recurrence that I'm seeing over and over again in this Bible. So, you know, after that I started, you know, speeding through some of the other mumbo jumbo to get to more of these prophet stories. And I got to the story, there are others, and there are some stories in the Bible that are not PG rated, period. They're not rated for talking anywhere. You know, you would need an 18 and up ID card to be able for me to even tell you these stories. So the one that intrigued me, that caught my attention the most, was of my most beloved story in the Bible, and that was of David and Goliath. That was my most intriguing story to me, because not only was, you know, it said that in the Bible that David was a very small man and Goliath was a very big man, and that was appealing to me because I've always been very short, and as a kid I was really short. So, you know, I said this was a very beautiful story to me, just in its prose and in its concept of overcoming. And so I started to read about David. And there are very beautiful stories about David in the Bible. There are indeed. But there is one story about David in the Bible that shocked me to my core. And it's a story about three people. There's three people in this drama: David, Bathsheba, and Uriah. And it says that David saw this woman named Bathsheba. And she was one of the most beautiful women of her time. And she happened to be married to one of the commanders of his army named Uriah. But David on this day decided that he was not able to resist his temptation to be with this woman Bathsheba, so he did. And he committed adultery with her. And knowing that he did this, the way that he decided to cover it up was he sent a letter to the generals of his army saying that when the battle was fierce, for everyone to pull back and abandon Uriah so that he would be killed, and when he dies then he could have Bathsheba, no harm, no foul. So David went from being the slayer of Goliath, the hero from man, to an adulterer, a plotter, and a murderer. And so this is when I really caught myself and said, hold on now. Something's wrong here. Something's got to give. I said, because to me, God's prophets in my mind were people of example. People who I could follow as an example, someone who was supposed to be the best of us, so that we could follow them and emulate them. And they're turning out to be worse than some of the people that you see on America's Most Wanted. David is somebody that, if I only knew this about him from the Bible, I see him coming down the street, I'm going the other way and calling 911, because he has to have a warrant out on him for something. This is what I'm thinking in my mind. This man is not an honorable man at all. He killed Goliath, yeah, but he killed this other guy named Uriah to be able to commit adultery with his wife. So I committed the cardinal sin in Christianity. I started asking questions. This is the one thing you do not do in Christianity, is you don't ask questions, especially not about issues like this. So I went to my pastor and I started asking questions. You know, what's going on here? You know, pastor, there's a very bad recurring habit about these men in the Bible. What is the deal here? And I remember he told me the same thing that almost every pastor or every evangelist or anyone I talked to about this, same answer, almost like it was programmed. They would put their hand on my shoulder and say, Brother Joshua, don't let a little bit of knowledge wreck your faith, because you're not justified by knowledge, you're justified by faith. And they would quote me verses like, lean not on understanding, you know, Paul's, we're justified by faith in Jesus Christ. You know, they would quote this whole line of thing to me like it was already pre-programmed, that they programmed in pastor school that people are going to ask you questions and here's the answer. So, you know, I said to myself, you know, I don't know, pastor, you know, this just seems kind of odd. He said, let me tell you something. What you're reading is the Old Testament referring to God's covenant with the children of Israel. And they were a different people, a very stubborn, crazy people. So why don't you move on to the New Testament? In the New Testament, you'll find the new covenant they were under with Jesus Christ, and I promise you things will change and be better. I said, okay, perfect. So I read went ahead and finished and got to Malachi and then started with the New Testament. So I opened the New Testament, I said, here we go. Let's start all over again. But there were a few things that I had learned from the Old Testament that I wanted to keep in mind when I started to read the New Testament. I learned, number one, that God was one in a unique sense. This is what I learned from the Old Testament, that God was one in a singular, unique sense. This is over and over and over and over very clearly in the Bible. God's nature is one. This is so clear through the Old Testament. And that He was very jealous about His worship. And every single time the children of Israel would turn to something else other than Him, He would punish them and restrict their lifestyle. This is something that I learned. And it kind of, the similitude to me with how God dealt with the children of Israel was, and I hate to use this stark contrast, but it's almost as if one of us went out, God forbid, I hope not, and let's say we went out here and robbed a bank. You rob a bank, you're going to jail for a long time. And every day when you wake up, do you think that jail is going to look like the Hilton at LAX? No, I doubt it. It's probably dark, cold, bad food, orange jumpsuits, not nice people, the whole 9 yards. And the reason why this is, and I know this now from studying psychology, is that this is supposed to be a stark reminder every single day when this person wakes up that you are in jail. This is supposed to remind them every single day you're in jail because you committed a crime. And we run this, not you. This is the message that is being portrayed to this person in jail. So when the children of Israel kept rebelling against God, He restricted their lifestyle. If you study Judaic law now, it is some of the most strict religious law you can find. All of the good things that we enjoy as Muslims, even when it comes to dietary laws, like the good parts of the meat that we are allowed to eat, they can't have these things. These are things that are restricted from them. Why? Because God, Allah, wanted to remind them every day that I am Allah. I am your God. You will worship me. I run this, not you. And I understood this from reading the Old Testament. This is a concept I had come across. So I started with the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And one other thing that I did when I started to read the Bible was, if you go to Barnes & Noble, let's say you go to Barnes & Noble and you take a book off the shelf, what is usually the first thing you look at? The title. Then the next thing, the author. You want to know the title and the author. What is the name of the book? Who wrote it? And if you do this test with every single book of the Bible, you get a title and no author. Author unknown. Or author is appears to be so-and-so. Or we derive that so-and-so possibly written this. Like let's just say for Exodus, they say Moses wrote Exodus. Which if you read some of Exodus, he couldn't have written all of Exodus because the last part of Exodus is Moses' death, burial, and Joshua taking over the children of Israel. And now, unless Moses was a sure indeed prophet that was able to write things after he died, then he did not write these things. And so when you go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I wanted to know Matthew who, Mark who, Luke who, John who, because it's called the Gospel according to Matthew. The bad thing is that no one knows. No one knows because no one penned their name down to these things. No Bible scholar in his right mind will tell you that we know for sure Matthew so-and-so wrote this, Mark so-and-so wrote this, Luke so-and-so wrote this, John so-and-so wrote this. It's factual information that we do not know who wrote these. So I was intrigued. I'm like, that doesn't, why would somebody write this book that's supposed to be passed down over generations and people are supposed to, this is the inspired word of God to guide mankind, and nobody decided to pin down who wrote it. But anyway, I started to read it, and I started to notice things about the teachings of Jesus Christ. And they were not what I had learned in church. When Jesus spoke, He spoke of the nature of God. And when He spoke of the nature of God, it was the same nature of God that I found in the Old Testament. Jesus said many times that God is one. God is unique. He would even quote from the Hebrew Scriptures. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is but one. When He was asked, what is the greatest commandment? Or He was asked the greatest commandment. He said the greatest commandment, and every Muslim should understand these two concepts. This should be nothing new to you. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your strength, and then to love your neighbor as you love yourself. He said the rest hang on these two, which we know in Islam we have rights of the Creator and rights of the creation. So this was the concept that He was teaching. And he even said in 1 John 5:17, and this was more clear to me than anything else can be, this is life eternal, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. And when you look at that in the Greek and the Aramaic, it is almost exactly to a T of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Now that I know Arabic and have understood that, very same similar statements. Yes, indeed, there were some implicit statements.
La ilaha illallah, 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 ilahe illallah, la 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 ilahe illallah. La ilahe illallah, 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 la ilahe illallah. La ilahe illallah, 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 la ilahe
And every Muslim should understand these two concepts. This should be nothing new to you. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your strength, and then to love your neighbor as you love yourself. He said the rest hang on these two, which we know in Islam we have rights of the Creator and rights of the creation. So this was the concept that he was teaching. And he even said in 1 John 5:17, and this was more clear to me than anything else can be, this is life eternal, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. And when you look at that in the Greek and the Aramaic, it is almost exactly to a T of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Now that I know Arabic and have understood that, very same similar statements. Yes, indeed, there were some implicit statements